Hello everyone, and welcome back to Scary Interesting. In this video, we're going to go over two stories that are, in my opinion, some of the most interesting and tragic stories that have ever been covered on the channel. The second story in particular is so unbelievable that I actually removed the others I originally planned to go along with it because I felt that they were actually so overshadowed by it. But anyways, I hope you feel the same way, and as always, viewer discretion is advised. Bruce Bairnsfather huddled deep in the frozen muck of his trench on Christmas Eve 1914, but there was nothing festive about his surroundings. The trench was little more than a 3-foot or 1 meter deep rut in the mud in Belgium filled with stale air and damp cigarettes. His uniform was stiff with the same mud, his boots were soaked through, and he held his rifle more out of habit than immediate necessity. By then, the war had settled into a grim stalemate, and this night was like any other, cold, miserable, and haunted by the ever-present threat of gunfire. As he shivered in the darkness though, Bruce suddenly noticed something strange. The noise drifted across an area known as No Man's Land, softly at first and barely distinguishable over the wind. Bruce then lifted his head, listening, and soon it was unmistakable. The Germans were actually singing a song. The words were foreign, but the tune was the familiar Still Nacht, or Silent Night. Bruce then turned to a fellow soldier and asked if he also heard the voices. The man nodded, saying that the Germans had been at it for some time now. At that moment, the war seemed to pause. Then, in an almost impulsive answer to the haunting song, a British voice tentatively joined in from another trench. Another followed after that, and soon, Silent Night echoed in 2 languages across the battlefield. Lanterns then appeared along the enemy lines, flickering in the darkness, and small Christmas trees were lifted above the trenches. Then, a voice came from the German side in English, strong and clear despite a heavy accent, beckoning the British to come over to the other side. Understandably, this invitation was met with uncertainty. Was this some sort of trick, or were the Germans trying to lure the British into an ambush? But Bruce then watched as figures moved in the darkness, cautiously climbing out of their trenches and stepping onto No Man's Land. He then held his breath, waiting for the inevitable crack of gunfire, but none came. Instead, he saw something completely unexpected. It was the beginning of something truly extraordinary, something that would defy the horror of war, if only for a brief time. In the winter of 1914, on the Western Front in World War I, a war which many had believed would be over in a matter of months had instead descended into an unrelenting back and forth. Hopes of being home for Christmas had long since faded, replaced by the brutal reality of trench warfare. Only a few months into the conflict, the war was already on its way to becoming one of the bloodiest in human history. By December, the Western Front stretched in a near continuous line from the North Sea to the Swiss border. Soldiers lived in these crude trenches carved into the frozen earth, and their lives were dictated by the constant threat of artillery shells, sniper fire, and disease. The trenches were also foul and infested, filled with stagnant water that turned the ground into mud. Rats also swarmed through the dugouts, feasting on discarded scraps and at times the unburied. And trenchfoot, a rotting skin condition caused by a prolonged exposure to wet conditions, also crippled many of the men. No Man's Land was the area between opposing trenches and was a wasteland of barbed wire and unclaimed corpses. Despite the ongoing hostility though, there were times when soldiers driven by a sense of shared suffering formed an unspoken agreement to avoid unnecessary killing. This mutual understanding became known as live and let live, and occasionally allowed men on both sides to retrieve their fallen comrades or repair their fortifications without immediate fear of being shot. Then, as Christmas approached, although the war showed no signs of stopping, the holiday stirred something deeper within the men. Many of them had grown up with Christmas traditions featuring songs, feasts, and the warmth of family gatherings. But now instead, they found themselves shivering in the dark, separated from their loved ones by thousands of miles. Back in Germany, Kaiser Wilhelm II wanted to boost morale by sending small Christmas trees to the front. In response, some of the German soldiers then placed these atop their trenches. This simple but profound act would soon set in motion an event unlike anything the war had ever seen. On that Christmas Eve, as Bruce and his comrades continued to listen to the singing of German troops, they heard that German accent in English beckoning them to cross. After a long pause, one of their own responded, "You come halfway, I'll come halfway." And then, astonishingly, they did. German troops slowly crept out of the trenches, cautiously at first, with their hands raised to show they carried no weapons. A few British soldiers then did the same, climbing hesitantly from their frozen dugouts. That moment must have felt like an eternity as they took slow, tentative steps toward the middle of No Man's Land. Because again, this was a place that to that point had been the most brutal area of an already horrific war. But on that night, it became something else entirely. It became a meeting ground for men who for the briefest moments saw each other not as enemies but as fellow human beings. There were no commanders here or orders to follow, just men acting on instinct, drawn toward an impossible truce by something greater than war. Some shook hands, some laughed in disbelief, and others exchanged wary nods. From their pockets, the soldiers then pulled out whatever gifts they could, including cigarettes, chocolate, biscuits, and small tokens that were exchanged as if they were friends rather than sworn adversaries. A few men even shared photographs of their families, pointing to these smiling faces that seemed a world away. Others patted each other on the back, sharing a word or two in broken German or English. As the first light of Christmas morning broke over the battlefield, someone produced a soccer ball. Where it came from, no one would quite remember, but suddenly, boots that had been made for marching and trench digging were now kicking a ball across the battlefield. In his diary, a German lieutenant later wrote about how marvelously wonderful a sight it was that Christmas, a celebration of love, managed to bring mortal enemies together as friends for a time. Other diaries and letters home describe a British soldier who was a barber back home setting up a makeshift barbershop right there in no man's land, offering haircuts to German soldiers in exchange for a few cigarettes. As heartwarming and bittersweet as this was, though, not every moment that Christmas was filled with laughter across the Western Front. For some, the truce was a solemn occasion. Many of the dead, who the soldiers had no choice but to leave where they had fallen, were finally given a burial. British and German soldiers worked together to carry fallen comrades, saying prayers over the bodies before covering them with earth. For those who had lost close friends in the battle, the moment was heavy with grief. This unbelievable occasion would extend to Christmas Day, but tragically, the killing would start again. And the truce wasn't universal either. The British-controlled Western Front stretched for 30 miles, and in some areas, the war didn't pause. A few soldiers who stepped into no man's land that night would never return. And then by the time December 26th arrived, the fragile peace that had settled over the trenches began to crumble. The men who had shaken hands in no man's land the day before now found themselves back in the mud, staring at the same enemy they had shared cigarettes and laughter with only a few hours earlier. Orders from high command had also begun circulating, reminding them that the war was not meant to be paused, even for Christmas. And while some pockets of the Western Front saw the ceasefire extend into New Year's Day, in most places the war continued. Officers, many of whom had been upset by the spontaneous truce, quickly reasserted their authority. Like, for example, British General Sir Horace Smith Dorrien issued orders forbidding further fraternization, fearing that these displays of goodwill would weaken the men's fighting spirit. German commanders likewise instructed their troops to return to their positions and prepare for renewed combat. And the message afterward was clear: this war was not over and there would be no more singing across the trenches. As you might imagine, for some soldiers, picking up their rifles again felt unnatural after what had just taken place. The men who had clinked bottles and played soccer together hesitated as they returned to their posts, reluctant to open fire upon those they had come to see, if only briefly, as comrades. Some units even officially adopted the live and let live policy, refraining from unnecessary aggression for as long as possible, but in most places, the war resumed with full force. For top military officials, the Christmas truce was an alarming development and one that could not be repeated. In the following years, steps were taken to ensure that such a moment of peace would never occur again. The winter of 1915 saw stricter enforcement of orders, warnings against fraternization, and increased threats of punishment for soldiers caught attempting to recreate the truce. Propaganda was used to dehumanize the enemy further, reminding soldiers that their duty was to fight, not befriend those on the other side. So after 1914, there would be no widespread Christmas truces. But despite the best efforts of military leaders to suppress the memory of the truce, it lived on in the letters and diaries of the men who had experienced it. Accounts of the extraordinary event made their way home, where families read in astonishment about the brief peace amidst the carnage. It's become a testament to the humanity that could exist even in the darkest of times, and a reminder that war, at its core, is fought by men who are not so different from each other. It was a beautiful spring day in May of 1979 as an American Airlines aircraft was preparing for takeoff. The sun reflected off the plane, making it almost impossible to look at from just the right angle, as David Booth stood next to a one-story yellow brick building watching intently. David watched as it sped away from him before lifting off the ground for what appeared to be a textbook takeoff, but something was wrong. Something about the sound the plane was making was off. This was subtle at first, but soon impossible to ignore. Then suddenly, the plane's right wing lifted and the aircraft tilted as it struggled to take to the sky, rolling at such an extreme angle that it almost looked like it was about to be flying upside down. Then, in an instant, the nose of the plane pointed downward and hurtled toward the earth. David's heart pounded as he stood there frozen, watching the inevitable. Then, there was the impact. The deafening explosion and the firestorm that followed was unlike anything he had ever seen. The force of it sent a shockwave through the ground and slammed into his chest, and the heat was unbearable and the air was filled with the smell of burning fuel. Horrifyingly, screams also echoed through the inferno, and for a split second, David felt like he was inside the plane. Then in the next second, he gasped, jolting upright in bed, drenched in sweat. His chest heaved as he struggled to breathe, with his mind still reliving the burning wreckage. Then the plane was gone and the explosion had vanished. He was just alone in his bedroom, staring into the dark, and luckily it had all been a dream, but the terror felt real. The vision had been too vivid and too precise. Every detail was burned into his memory as if he had truly stood at the edge of the runway, watching the disaster unfold. He then forced himself to lie back down, but he wasn't able to fall back asleep. No matter what David did that day, he couldn't get the dream out of his head. And although he was exhausted from not getting enough sleep, the fatigue was nothing compared to the fear. He had never experienced a dream like it before, and as nighttime approached, he grew more and more apprehensive. But at some point, his exhaustion was too much and he did fall asleep, only to have the exact same vision and awaken in the middle of the night, once again soaked and terrified. This then happened again the next night, and the next, for 10 consecutive nights. The horrifying premonition played on repeat, searing itself into his consciousness, and with each passing day, the sinking dread grew stronger. He tried to push it aside, telling himself that it was only a dream, but it seemed like the moment his head would hit the pillow, the nightmare would return. Now, David wasn't a man prone to superstition. He was quiet, rational, and by all accounts completely ordinary. He had lived an average life as a married man, raising a family and working in the rental car business in Ohio. Everything started with that first random dream sometime in the early morning hours of May 16th, 1979, but it quickly became clear that there was nothing random about it. Each of the following nights, the same terrifying sequence played out in his sleep. The bright sunlit day, the long runway, the massive American Airlines jet taxiing for takeoff, something going wrong, a sickening shift in sound, a tilt, a roll, and then an explosion. Then, following this, David woke up in a panic each time. And he didn't know why, but the dream felt like something more. It felt like a warning, and an urgency had begun to build within him that he was meant to do something or stop something from happening. But how could he stop a nightmare? On May 22nd, after 7 nights of the same terror, David reached out for help. He hesitated before picking up the phone, debating whether anyone would even listen to him. But he did eventually dial the number, and he found himself speaking with the Cincinnati office of the Federal Aviation Administration, or FAA. A man named Paul Williams answered, and David began describing his dream, feeling more and more foolish as the words slipped from his mouth. Strangely, however, Paul didn't laugh or hang up, and he didn't dismiss David outright. Instead, he asked questions like what kind of plane was it and what did it look like? David obviously wasn't an aviation expert, and he didn't know much about airplanes and could only tell Paul that it was an American Airlines plane. Paul then pressed him further, and after some discussion, they determined that it was likely a DC-10. This is a plane with 3 engines with one mounted on the tail. David then also spoke to Jack Barker, the FAA's public affairs director, who also listened to the Ohio man with an open mind. Something about the way David spoke to him unnerved him. He sounded rational, not like a conspiracy theorist or a crackpot. There was no hysteria in his voice at all, only exhaustion and something deeper that seemed to border on desperation. But obviously, at the same time, what could they do? David's dream didn't give a flight number, didn't give a location, just the plane, the crash, and the explosion. Numbers occasionally surfaced in the dream, but none of them made sense. The FAA had no reason to believe a plane was in danger, but still, they listened. At the end of the conversation with David, Jack thanked him for calling, but warned him that there was nothing they could do about it. So, after the phone call, David hung up feeling empty. He had done all that he could, yet it didn't feel like it was nearly enough. Then, later that night, the dream came again. He woke up shaking, staring into the darkness as he had before, but this time he somehow knew that time was running out. Then on May 25th, something shifted. The dream played out as it always did, but this time, a sense of finality hung over it. This would be the last time. He didn't know how he knew, but he did. The plane crashed, the fire swallowed everything, and then it was over. David then opened his eyes, staring at the ceiling. The dread that had overwhelmed him for 10 nights straight had settled into something heavier. He just knew something terrible was about to happen. May 25th, 1979 was like any other day at Chicago's O'Hare International Airport. Travelers made their way through terminals, business people hurried to catch flights, and vacationers eagerly anticipated their destinations. The air traffic controllers monitored their screens from the tower and tracked the movements of hundreds of aircraft as they departed and arrived. Among these planes was American Airlines Flight 191, which was a DC-10 bound for Los Angeles. At 2:50 p.m., the passengers boarded, and among them were families, professionals, and book industry representatives heading to an American Booksellers Association convention. Captain Walter Lux, an experienced pilot with more than 22,000 flight hours, was in command, joined by a first officer and a flight engineer. All 3 of them were seasoned professionals, and no one had any reason to suspect that this would be anything but a routine flight. At 3:02 p.m., Flight 191 sat at the end of the runway and received clearance for takeoff. The aircraft accelerated down the runway before reaching its designated speed, but just as it lifted off the ground, disaster struck. The left engine tore away from the wing, flipping up and over the top of the aircraft before slamming onto the runway below. With the engine's violent detachment, several key systems also failed. Hydraulic lines were severed, causing the slats on the left wing to retract, and the result was catastrophic. The plane immediately lost stability and the left wing lost lift. It then began to roll, and within seconds it reached an impossible 112-degree bank. In the cockpit, the captain and his crew struggled desperately to regain control, but the damage was irreversible. The DC-10, climbing no higher than 350 feet, now plunged toward the earth. It cleared the airport perimeter before careening into an abandoned airfield just outside the runway, and the impact was instant and devastating. At 3:03 p.m., Flight 191 slammed into the ground, bursting into a massive fireball. The aircraft disintegrated on impact, scattering debris across the field and into an adjacent mobile home park. 2 trailers were destroyed by this, and 2 people on the ground lost their lives. Emergency responders also rushed to the scene, but there were no survivors. All 258 passengers and 13 crew members perished in the inferno. News of the crash spread rapidly, and Chicago's emergency services were overwhelmed with calls, and local hospitals braced for an influx of survivors, but they would never come. Back in Ohio, David was at work when the phone rang. A shaken voice on the other end delivered the news, and the words made his body go cold. The nightmare had become real. He had seen it and lived it night after night, and yet he was powerless to stop it. He then collapsed into his chair in tears. Back at the FAA, Paul and Jack were in shock. The moment they heard the news, they knew that this was what David had warned them about. The details were uncanny: an American Airlines DC-10 rolling onto its side and crashing in a fiery explosion. In the coming days, the investigation into the crash would reveal that improper maintenance procedures had led to a structural failure that caused the engine to detach. But for those who listened to David's warning, the technical explanation offered no comfort. He had tried to warn the world, and no one had been able to do a thing about it. The crash of Flight 191 remains one of the deadliest and most tragic in aviation history, with 273 people losing their lives that day in 1979. But David's premonitions, believe it or not, are hardly where the eerie events surrounding the flight end. For starters, the flight number 191 already had a horrifying history. To that point, 3 flights assigned the number 191 between 1963 and 1972 had ended in deadly crashes. Today, that number actually stands at 6, with the last occurring in 2012. Now, this is apparently not enough to be statistically significant, but it is still a strange coincidence. But dig a little deeper and you'll find that David wasn't the only one who received some kind of warning about the crash. A woman named Lindsay and her mother had tickets on the 1979 flight and were waiting at the gate for boarding to begin. Suddenly and inexplicably, Lindsay experienced what she later described as a psychic flash of a plane crashing. And like David, she wasn't some sort of psychic who claimed to have abilities to see into the future. She was just an average person with a flight that day, but something so strong came over her before boarding that she begged her mother to switch flights. In her case, the premonitions saved their lives because they rebooked on a later flight. Another passenger on Flight 191 was an author named Judith who was heading to the booksellers convention to promote her new book. At one point in her story, Judith reveals that she developed a near crippling fear of flying and mentioned that whenever she was required to travel for business, her head would tremble from takeoff to landing. This anecdote appears on an interesting page of her book, page 191. Tragically, Judith was one of 273 people who lost their lives in the crash. Now, if you're familiar with the channel, you probably know that there's never really been anything paranormal featured on the channel. I don't think I've ever actually explicitly said why, but the reason for that is that often in many of those stories, upon looking into them a little further, it's pretty obvious they are rational explanations. This is probably in large part due to the fact that witnesses are just notoriously unreliable, and so it's just difficult to write about a topic when you don't think the events are as they've been portrayed. With that said though, after the crash of Flight 191 in Chicago, there are reports that are very strange, and they're interesting enough to at least mention whether or not they actually occurred. In the days and weeks following the crash, the field where the DC-10 had gone down was cleared of debris, but eerie reports began to surface. Drivers passing by the site at night claimed to see strange bobbing lights hovering over the field, flickering like lanterns before vanishing. Others reported hearing inexplicable sounds like faint cries, moans, and the distant whine of an engine struggling against the air, only to be followed by a phantom explosion. Residents of the nearby mobile home park, located just beyond the crash site, also experienced bizarre disturbances. Dogs that had never shown aggression before began barking frantically at seemingly nothing with their eyes fixed on the empty airfield. Some homeowners had also apparently been awakened in the middle of the night to the sound of urgent knocking on their doors, only to open them and find no one there. Others have recounted sightings of a disoriented man appearing at their doorsteps, mumbling something about needing to retrieve his luggage before vanishing into the night. Maybe the most chilling report, though, came from a mobile home owner who was walking his dog near the site one night. He described being approached by a young man who frantically asked for the location of the nearest telephone. But there was something strange about him. The young figure smelled strongly of fuel, and smoke seemed to rise from his clothing as if he had just stepped out of a fire. The dog walker then turned to point toward a nearby payphone, but when he turned back, the man was gone. Inside the airport, travelers and airport employees have supposedly seen a mysterious figure near the departure gate once used by Flight 191. Multiple witnesses claim to have seen a man using a payphone only for him to take a few steps and disappear into thin air. Whether these strange reports were simply the figments of overactive imaginations or something more, they certainly add to the strangeness with David and the other passengers. And as you might imagine, for David, the events of May 25th, 1979 changed his life forever. He experienced something beyond rational explanation. After the crash, the FAA handed over his notes on his testimony to the Institute of Parapsychology in Durham, North Carolina, with the hope that experts might shed light on his inexplicable visions, but they were dumbfounded. And ever since the 10th night of the reoccurring dream, David hasn't experienced it again, nor has he ever had any dreams that mimic just how vivid and real his Flight 191 nightmares were. If you made it this far, thanks so much for watching. If you want to listen to the audio-only version of these videos, you can listen wherever you listen to podcasts. Also, if you have a story suggestion, feel free to submit it to the form found in the description. If you want to support the channel, consider joining the Patreon or becoming a channel member here on YouTube. Anyways, thanks again, and hopefully I will see you in the next one.